She had packed everything she owned into a single trunk, crossed 4 states on a rattling train, and married a man she had never met. All because she had nothing left to lose. But the moment Evelyn Mercer stepped off that wagon and looked at the house waiting for her at the edge of the Wyoming frontier, she understood that nothing left to lose was a lie she had told herself to survive the journey. Because standing on that porch, staring at her with eyes that held no welcome whatsoever, was a 12-year-old boy who had already decided she was his enemy. If you've ever walked into a place where you weren't wanted, where every wall and every silence made clear that your presence was an intrusion, then you already know what Evelyn felt in that first moment. Stay with this story until the very end. If it moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The train had been delayed twice. Once outside of Cheyenne because of a broken coupling, and once for reasons nobody bothered to explain to the passengers in the third-class car. By the time Evelyn arrived in the town of Harlan's Crossing, Wyoming Territory, she had been traveling for 11 days. Her dress was wrinkled beyond recovery. The small brooch her mother had given her, the only piece of jewelry she still owned, had come loose somewhere in Nebraska, and she hadn't noticed until it was too late. She carried 1 trunk, 1 carpet bag, and an envelope containing a marriage certificate signed 2 days earlier at the county clerk's office in town, a legal formality completed before she had even seen the ranch. That was how these arrangements worked. She understood that going in. Caleb Hawthorne had met her at the clerk's office exactly as promised. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had spent too many seasons under an open sky, weathered and drawn, with lines around his eyes that were not entirely from squinting. He had shaken her hand, which struck her as an odd gesture for a man meeting his new wife, and said very little during the signing. He had answered her questions with short, accurate sentences. Yes, the ranch was 12 miles from town. Yes, there were 2 children. Yes, the house had a proper bedroom. He had not asked her a single question in return, and she had not known whether to take that as indifference or as the particular stillness of a man who had learned to keep things close. The ride out to the ranch had been quiet in the way that made the distance feel longer than 12 miles. "The children know I'm coming?" she had asked, somewhere around mile 8, when the silence had stretched past the point she could comfortably hold. "They know," Caleb said. "What did you tell them?" He considered the question for longer than it warranted. "I told them you were coming to help." She had looked at him then, this man she had just married. "Help," she repeated. "That's what I said." Evelyn turned back to the road ahead and decided not to press it. She had corresponded with this man for 4 months. His letters had been honest in the way that certain kinds of letters are honest. Factual, careful, containing no outright lies, but also revealing very little of what actually lived beneath the surface. She had known going in that he was a widower, that he had lost his wife, Margaret, to a fever 2 years prior, that he had a son named Noah and a daughter named Lucy, that the ranch ran about 400 head of cattle and was currently profitable, though the last 2 seasons had been harder than usual. What his letters had not conveyed was the particular quality of his grief, the way it sat on him like weather. The house came into view around a bend in the road, and Evelyn's first thought was that it had good bones. It was a 2-story structure built from timber and stone, with a covered porch running the length of the front face. Her second thought was that it looked tired. Not neglected exactly, but unloved. The way a place looks when the people inside it are surviving rather than living. The yard had gone to dry grass. A window shutter on the upper floor hung slightly crooked. The porch railing had a gap where a board was missing. But it was the children she noticed most. Lucy was standing at the far end of the porch, holding on to the railing post with both hands, watching the wagon approach with enormous eyes. She was small for what Evelyn guessed was 6 or 7 years old, fine-boned and pale, with her hair pulled back in a braid that had been done clumsily. Done, Evelyn thought, by a man who had tried his best with something he didn't quite know how to do. Noah was not on the porch. He was standing in the yard, 10 feet back from where the wagon would stop, arms crossed over his chest. He was 12, Caleb had told her, and he looked it, caught in that particular stage where the child and the young man were still negotiating, where the jaw had started to sharpen but the eyes could still go soft without warning. His eyes were not soft now. He watched the wagon with the flat, assessing expression of someone who had already made up his mind. Caleb pulled the team to a stop. He climbed down without ceremony and moved to tie off the horses. He did not come around to help Evelyn down. She climbed down herself. "Lucy," Caleb said, without looking at the girl, "come say hello." Lucy released the railing post and walked to the edge of the porch steps, but did not descend them. She looked at Evelyn with open, wondering curiosity, the kind that hadn't yet learned to disguise itself as something cooler. "Hello," Evelyn said. She kept her voice easy, unhurried. "You must be Lucy." "Yes, ma'am." The girl's voice was just above a whisper. "I'm Evelyn." Lucy nodded as though she had already known this and was simply confirming it. Evelyn looked toward Noah, who had not moved from his position in the yard. "And you're Noah," she said. Not a question. He said nothing. "Noah." Caleb's voice carried a quiet warning. "Hello," Noah said. The word was flat as a stone, carrying nothing on it. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment. She had anticipated this, or at least she had tried to. In her more honest moments during the train journey, she had thought through the various ways this arrival might go, and a resentful child had been somewhere on the list. But thinking through a thing and standing inside it are entirely different experiences. There was something in Noah's eyes that was more than simple hostility. It was a specific kind of pain that had hardened at the edges into something that looked, from the outside, like anger. She recognized it because she had felt something like it herself, not too many years ago. She did not push. She turned back to the wagon and reached for her carpet bag. "I'll get the trunk," Caleb said, and moved past her. The kitchen was the first room she actually looked at, because it was the room that told her the most. It was large enough, a good working kitchen with a proper cast iron stove and a pump at the sink and enough counter space to work a decent meal. But the shelves were sparse in the way that said nobody had taken much pleasure in cooking for a long time. The staples were there: flour, salt, dried beans, a few tins. But the kind of small extras that accumulate in a kitchen where someone is paying attention. A jar of dried herbs, a crock of preserved something, the small evidences of care, those were absent. The table had 4 chairs, one of which, she noticed, had a cushion tied to its seat. The cushion was flattened and faded, as though it had been there a long time. She did not ask whose it had been. Caleb set her trunk at the foot of the stairs. "Your room is up and to the left," he said. "I've been in the room at the end of the hall." "All right," she said. He looked at her for a moment, as though he had been about to say something else, and then decided against it. "I need to check the north fence before dark," he said. "There's cornbread in the tin if you're hungry. I'll be back by supper." He took his hat from the hook by the door and went back outside. Lucy had followed them inside and was hovering at the edge of the kitchen doorway, watching Evelyn with the same wondering attention she had shown on the porch. Noah had not come in. Evelyn set down her carpet bag. She looked at the kitchen, at the sparse shelves, at the faded cushion on the chair. Then she looked at Lucy. "Are you hungry?" she asked. "A little," Lucy admitted. "Well," Evelyn said, "let's see what we can do about that." She found the cornbread in the tin, as Caleb had said. She also found enough in the kitchen to put together a decent pot of beans, soaked and ready, she suspected, because Caleb had started them that morning with some awareness that cooking would need to happen. She found dried sage on a forgotten shelf behind a larger tin, nearly empty but still fragrant, and she crumbled some into the beans because it was there and because it seemed right. Lucy sat at the table and watched her work. The girl was quiet, but not in a wounded way. It was more the quiet of a child who had learned to be careful, to wait and see before committing to anything. She asked small questions periodically. Where was Evelyn from? Did she like horses? Had she ever seen a real city? Evelyn answered all of them without embellishment. She was from Philadelphia. She could ride, though not well. She had lived in a city her whole life until recently, and she was still making up her mind about the difference. "Philadelphia is very far away," Lucy said, as though she had been calculating this. "It is," Evelyn agreed. "Why did you come here?" Evelyn considered giving the girl the simplified version. Instead, she said, "Because I needed somewhere to go, and your father's letter seemed honest." Lucy absorbed this. "Was it? Honest?" "Mostly," Evelyn said. The beans were simmering when Noah finally came inside. He came through the back door, moving with the particular deliberateness of someone who has decided to do a thing and is doing it before they can change their mind. He stopped just inside the door when he saw Evelyn at the stove. "Supper won't be ready for another half hour," she said, without turning around. "If you're hungry, the cornbread's in the tin." A pause. Then the sound of the tin being opened. She didn't make anything of it. He ate standing at the counter, which told her everything about where he had put her in his mind. He was not going to sit at the table with her. Not yet. Not without being forced to. She didn't force it. "Your father said you help with the cattle," she said, "because silence can become its own kind of territory if you let it." "Yeah," Noah said. "Do you ride out with him most days?" "When there's work." "Is there usually work?" A beat. "There's always work on a cattle ranch." She heard something in that, not pride exactly, but the closest thing to it that he was willing to let her hear. She filed it away. Caleb came in just as the sun dropped below the ridge, bringing the cold that followed behind it on the open Wyoming plain. He washed up at the pump outside, dried his hands on a worn cloth, and came to the table without the particular hesitation of a man entering a home that had changed since he left it. He sat down in his chair, not the one with the cushion, and looked at the pot of beans and the cornbread Evelyn had sliced, and the small jar of wild plum preserve she had found at the back of the pantry, and set out because there was no reason not to. Something moved across his face. It was brief, and she would not have caught it if she hadn't been watching. "You found the sage," he said. "It was on the back shelf." He nodded. Margaret grew it. There it was, the name, the first time it had been spoken since Evelyn arrived, and it landed on the table between them like something solid, with weight. "She had a good eye for herbs," Evelyn said, because she didn't know what else to say, and silence felt wrong. "She did," Caleb said. Lucy was already sitting, her hands folded in her lap the way a child sits when they have been taught to wait. Noah took his chair without comment. Evelyn served the beans. Nobody said much, but it was a different kind of quiet than the drive out from town, less empty somehow, as though the kitchen itself had remembered what it was for. After supper, Noah disappeared upstairs without a word. Caleb took his coffee out to the porch, and Evelyn didn't follow him. She washed the dishes while Lucy sat on the counter and talked about a barn cat who had recently produced 4 kittens, and the particular difficulty of naming all 4 of them when you didn't want to play favorites. "Papa said we could only keep 2, Lucy said, with the tone of someone reporting a persistent injustice. "That's probably wise," Evelyn said. "I want to keep all of them." "I know. Do you like cats?" "I do." Lucy considered this for a moment. "Good," she said finally, as though the matter had been submitted and ruled on. The bedroom was clean. Caleb had made sure of that much. The bed had been made with fresh linens, a little stiff, the way linens get when they have been stored rather than used. There was a window that looked out over the yard and the dark shape of the barn beyond, a washstand in the corner, a hook on the wall for clothing, a small rag rug on the floor that was worn thin at the center. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room. She had told herself, on the train, that she was not looking for sentiment. She was looking for solidity, for something real she could put her hands on and build from. She was 31 years old. She had been engaged twice, the first time to a man who had died of typhoid before the wedding, and the second time to a man who had simply not shown up. She had worked for 6 years as a seamstress in her aunt's shop, and the shop had burned down in January. And she had looked at what remained of her life in Philadelphia and understood that it was very small and getting smaller. She was not a romantic. She did not believe she would come to this ranch and fall immediately into something beautiful. She had expected difficulty. She had expected distance. She had expected, in some form, the expression she had seen on Noah's face in the yard, that flat, refusing look that said, "You are not wanted here." She had not expected to feel it this sharply. She lay back on the stiff linens and stared at the ceiling. Through the wall, she could hear the soft creak of the house settling in the cold. Somewhere outside, a horse shifted in the barn. The Wyoming dark was very quiet and very large, the kind of quiet that Philadelphia had never once produced, and she lay inside it and tried to decide whether it was peaceful or simply empty. She thought about the cushion on the chair. She thought about the dried sage on the back shelf. She thought about Noah's face, and the way Caleb had said her name, Margaret, with that careful, containing quality, like a man carrying something he didn't want to drop. She had known she was walking into a family broken by loss. She had known that on paper. But there's a thing that happens when the paper version of a reality meets the actual version, when the words become real people with real wounds. And Evelyn lay in the dark and felt the full weight of what she had agreed to. She didn't regret coming. She wasn't sure yet whether she had the courage to stay. Those felt like different questions. The first week was a study in careful distances. Lucy attached herself to Evelyn with the direct, uncomplicated need of a child who had been missing something specific and had now identified where it might be found. She appeared in the kitchen before breakfast, still in her nightdress, willing to help with anything. She trailed through the house, asking questions. She brought Evelyn a flat rock she had found by the creek because it had an interesting shape and presented it with the gravity of someone offering something valuable. Evelyn accepted it with the appropriate gravity. Noah moved through the house like a weather system, present and unavoidable, and expressing itself primarily through temperature. He was not cruel to her. He answered direct questions with minimal words. He did his chores, helped his father, ate at the table. But he kept a particular quality of attention on her, watching without appearing to watch. And she understood that she was being assessed by the only standard he was currently willing to apply. Was she here to replace his mother? Or was she here to erase her? She suspected those felt like the same thing to him. Caleb was harder to read. He was a man who worked from before dawn until after dark, which was partly the nature of ranching, and partly, she thought, a habit formed from grief. The particular exhaustion of a man who has learned that being busy keeps other things at bay. He was polite to her. He was fair. He asked her, once, if she had enough of what she needed, and when she said yes, he nodded and went back out to the barn. He did not initiate conversation. He did not linger. At night, he sat on the porch with his coffee, and sometimes she sat there too, and they existed in the same silence in a way that was not comfortable exactly, but was beginning to have a kind of shape to it. On the fourth night, he said, without preamble, Noah was with her when she died. Evelyn looked at him. Fever came on fast, Caleb said. He was looking out at the dark yard, not at her. I had gone for the doctor. By the time I got back, Noah had stayed with her. He was 10 years old. He stopped. A long pause. He doesn't talk about it. No, Evelyn said. I just wanted you to know. Thank you, she said, for telling me. He nodded once and drank his coffee, and they sat in the dark, and she thought, this is what the letters couldn't carry. This is the weight that doesn't fit in sentences. Aset. On the sixth day, she started on the house. Not dramatically, not with announcement. She simply began addressing what needed addressing, one thing at a time, because that was the only way she knew how to do anything. She repaired the shutter on the upper window, which required only a new pin and 20 minutes of effort. She swept the front porch and the steps, not because they were filthy, but because the accumulated grit of several seasons had made the boards look gray and forgotten. She found a broken crock in the pantry and filled it with dried grasses from the yard, which was the kind of thing that cost nothing and changes a room slightly. Lucy helped where she could, mostly by handing things and asking questions. Noah watched from a distance and said nothing. On the afternoon of the seventh day, Evelyn asked Lucy if she could show her where the kitchen garden had been. Lucy led her to the south side of the house, where a rectangle of earth still faintly outlined where someone had once grown things. The soil was tired and weedy, but not hopeless. Mama grew tomatoes, Lucy said. She crouched and touched the earth with one finger, as though confirming something. And beans. And she grew flowers along the edge, but I don't know what kind. Do you know if your father has any seeds stored? Lucy looked uncertain. There might be a tin in the barn. I've seen a tin. Evelyn looked at the garden plot. The season was already late. Too late for most things, but not for everything. Let's find the tin, she said. Ouch. It was Noah who found her there the next morning, crouched in the dirt of the garden plot, turning over the soil with a hand trowel she had discovered in the barn alongside the tin. He stopped at the corner of the house and watched her for a long moment without speaking. She kept working. That won't grow anything, he said finally. Season's too far gone. I know, she said. Then why are you digging it up? She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was standing with his arms at his sides for once, not crossed. A small thing, but she noticed it. Because the soil needs turning whether anything gets planted or not, she said. If it doesn't get work now, it'll be worse in spring. Your mother knew that, I'd guess. Something shifted in his face. It was not softening, not yet, but it was the particular flicker of a person who has been caught off guard by something they didn't expect. She did, he said. What else did she grow? Lucy mentioned tomatoes and beans. A pause. Squash, he said. She grew a lot of squash, said it was reliable. He hesitated as though deciding how much to give. She tried peppers one year, but they didn't take. Peppers are stubborn, Evelyn said. He almost said something. She could see it, the small internal negotiation. Then he turned and went back toward the barn, and she watched him go and she thought, there. That was something. Not much, but something. By the end of the second week, a routine had begun to establish itself, imperfect and halting, like a thing that has been kicked but keeps trying to stand. Evelyn made breakfast before Caleb went out, because she had noticed on the first morning that he had been eating standing at the counter with cold leftovers, and that seemed like an unnecessary hardship when she was here and capable of doing otherwise. He said nothing about the change, but he sat down at the table, which was an answer in itself. Lucy braided Evelyn's hair one morning with great seriousness and deep technical incompetence, and Evelyn wore the resulting lopsided construction for the entire day because the girl's pride was a fragile and valuable thing. It's very nice, Caleb said at supper, in a tone that suggested he was being careful. Lucy did it, Evelyn said. Lucy beamed. Noah looked at his plate, but she caught the corner of his mouth moving before he controlled it. It was on a Tuesday afternoon in the third week that the first real fracture showed. Evelyn had been going through the cedar chest in the corner of the main room. Not going through it exactly, but dusting around it, and the lid had been slightly open, and she had reached to close it properly, and she had seen inside. It was Margaret's things. Folded garments, a small mirror in a wooden frame, a hat she had apparently favored, pale blue with a ribbon, letters tied with twine, a child's drawing, Lucy's maybe, or Noah's when he was younger, with a woman in it rendered in the approximate style of someone who is 5 years old and very earnest. She had closed the lid immediately and stepped back, but Noah had seen her. He had been coming down the stairs and had stopped on the third step and seen her close that lid, and when she turned and found him there, his face was not the flat, refusing expression she had grown accustomed to. It was something rawer than that. I wasn't, she started. That's her things, he said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not anger exactly, not yet. Something that was still deciding what it was going to become. I know, she said. I was dusting the shelf above it, and the lid was open. I closed it. You weren't going through it? No. He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze and did not explain further, because further explanation would have been defensive, and she had nothing to be defensive about. He came down the remaining stairs and left through the front door without another word. She stood in the empty room and listened to the sound of the door settling back into its frame, and she thought, this is the real work, not the garden, not the meals, not the curtain she had rehung last week. The real work is this, the invisible, ungiven kind, where every step forward has to be earned against this specific grief, in this specific family, and there are no shortcuts and no guarantees and no clear measure of how you're doing. She picked up the dust cloth and went back to the shelf. That night, for the first time since she had arrived, she heard Noah crying. She had been awake. She was often awake, still adjusting to the sounds of this house, this land, and the sound came through the wall between their rooms, quiet and muffled. The way crying sounds when someone is trying very hard not to be heard. She lay still. She did not go to him. He would not have wanted that. Not from her, not yet. But she lay in the dark and listened, and she felt the weight of it in her chest, the weight of a 12-year-old boy who had stayed beside his dying mother because there was no one else, who had learned that love and loss are not separate things, who had decided that the safest response to both was to build a wall as fast as he could and station himself on top of it. She understood that wall. She had built a smaller version of it herself. It did not make her feel closer to him, exactly, but it made her feel something adjacent to that, a recognition, the way you sometimes recognize a stranger because they are carrying something you have carried yourself. She stared at the ceiling in the Wyoming dark and thought, I am going to need to be patient. And then she thought, more patient than I have ever been in my life. She was not sure she had that in her. She thought she might. She did not know for certain, but she had come 11 days on a train with a single trunk, and she had married a man she didn't know, and she had walked into a house that didn't want her, and she was still here. That had to count for something. Outside, a coyote called once from somewhere out on the plain, and the house was silent, and the Wyoming night was very large, and Evelyn Mercer lay inside it and tried to decide what kind of woman she was going to be. The morning after she heard Noah crying through the wall, Evelyn made biscuits. Not because biscuits solved anything. She was clear-eyed enough to know they didn't, but she had learned, in the years before this one, that grief doesn't respond well to being addressed directly. That sometimes the most honest thing you can offer a wounded person is something warm and ordinary, something that asks nothing of them, something that simply says, I am here, and I am not going anywhere, and here's breakfast. She had the biscuits in the oven before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. She made them the way her mother had shown her, with lard worked into the flour until it looked like rough sand, then cold water added sparingly. The dough turned only enough times to hold. Overworking was the ruin of biscuits. Her mother had said that enough times that it had stopped being advice and become something closer to philosophy. Caleb came down first, as he always did, pulling his suspenders up over his shoulders and stopping short when he smelled what was in the oven. He looked at Evelyn, then at the stove, then back at her with the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he already understood. Biscuits, he said. They'll be ready in 10 minutes, she said. He poured his coffee and sat down, and she noticed he didn't take it out to the porch the way he sometimes did when he was restless. He sat at the table and let the kitchen be warm around him, and she thought that was its own kind of answer. Noah came down 8 minutes later. He stopped 2 steps into the kitchen and stood there with his hair still uncombed and his eyes carrying the particular rawness of someone who has not slept cleanly. He looked at the table where Caleb was sitting, and then at Evelyn, who was pulling the biscuits from the oven and did not make eye contact with him because she knew that eye contact right now would be the wrong thing. Sit down, Caleb said, to no one in particular, in the way fathers sometimes speak to the room rather than to any one person. Noah sat. Lucy appeared a moment later with her hair completely loose and both boots in hand, dropping into her chair and trying to put them on simultaneously while also reaching for a biscuit. And the resulting small chaos was enough to move the room off the delicate edge it had been balanced on. Caleb said something dry about wearing shoes before grabbing food. Lucy argued the relative merits of her approach. And in the middle of this, Noah quietly took a biscuit and ate it without saying anything at all. But he ate it. Evelyn turned back to the stove and allowed herself a very small, private exhale. That was the 4th week, and it was also the week that things began to shift. Not quickly, not cleanly, but in the way things shift on the frontier, slowly and with considerable resistance, and only when the pressure has been building long enough that something has to give. She had started washing and rehanging the curtains in the main room the week before, not because the curtains were particularly dirty, but because they had gone stiff and colorless from too long in one position, and there is something about a curtain that moves in a draft that makes a room feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. She had found an extra length of fabric in the cedar chest, not Margaret's chest, which she had not opened again, but a general storage chest in the back room, and she had hemmed it and hung it in the kitchen window, where the old one had rotted at the rings. It was a small thing. She did not announce it. But Caleb had stood in the kitchen doorway that evening and looked at the new curtain for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully name. Not quite grief, not quite relief, something in between the two. The old one was done, he said. It was, she said. He nodded and went to wash up, and that was all. But the next morning he had fixed the gap in the porch railing. She saw him out there with a board and a hammer before she'd even started the coffee. And she understood that something had been exchanged, even if neither of them had the language for it yet. The braid became a recurring event. Lucy had decided, following her initial experiment, that Evelyn's hair was a project worth pursuing. She arrived at Evelyn's bedroom door on a Thursday morning with a comb and a length of ribbon she had located from somewhere, and presented herself with the no-nonsense air of someone who has a job to do. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and let her work. Lucy's technique remained adventurous. She had not inherited any particular gift for it, and the braid she produced was more architectural ambition than skilled execution. But she was earnest, and she narrated everything as she went, which Evelyn found she didn't mind. "Mama used to braid my hair," Lucy said, working through a tangle with more enthusiasm than precision. "She was very fast, she didn't even have to look." "That takes practice," Evelyn said. "She braided it every morning before school. I don't go to school anymore. Papa says there'll be a school teacher in Harlan's Crossing in the fall." "That'll be good." "I don't know." Lucy was quiet for a moment, concentrating. "School was in a different town before, when Mama was alive. We were closer to town then." She tugged at a knot with more force than necessary, and Evelyn kept her expression neutral. "Papa moved us further out after she died. I think he didn't want to see people." Evelyn absorbed this. She had not known they had relocated. Caleb's letters had made no mention of it. "Does that bother you?" she asked. "Being further out?" "Sometimes," Lucy said. "It's very quiet. Noah says it builds character, but I think he just says that because he doesn't want to admit that he's lonely, too." Evelyn said nothing to that because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be too much. "There," Lucy announced, with the satisfaction of a completed work. "I think that's my best one yet." It was not her best one yet. It was possible it was slightly worse than the previous effort. But Lucy's face was bright with genuine pleasure, and Evelyn stood up and went to the small mirror on the wall and looked at her reflection with the appropriate expression of admiration. "It's a good one," she said. Lucy grinned. That afternoon, Evelyn found a way to show Lucy how to braid. Not by taking over, but she had no intention of undermining the girl's enthusiasm with competence. She sat beside her with a length of rope from the barn, which had the advantage of being braidable without belonging to anyone's head, and she talked through the mechanics slowly, letting Lucy figure it out with her hands rather than being instructed at. They went through it 4 times before Lucy got the crossings right. By the 5th, she was doing it from memory. "Like this?" Lucy held up the rope, neatly braided. "Exactly like that." The girl looked at it with the focused satisfaction of someone who has solved something real. Then she looked at Evelyn. "Can we do yours tomorrow, with the right crossings?" "We can." Noah had been in the doorway for the last few minutes of this exchange. Evelyn had seen him there without acknowledging it. When she looked up, he was already gone, but he had been there. She counted that. The evenings became their own territory. After supper, once the dishes were done, the family had settled into a loose pattern without quite deciding to. Caleb sat at the table with the ranch ledger or with whatever correspondence had come from town, working through it methodically. Lucy occupied herself variously, with the kittens, who had been moved from the barn into a box near the kitchen stove now that the nights were cold, or with a picture book she had nearly memorized, or by attempting to braid the barn cat's tail, which the barn cat received with less patience than Lucy felt was warranted. Noah sat at the far end of the table and read, or appeared to read. He was working through a volume of frontier geography that Caleb had obtained from somewhere, and whether he was genuinely absorbed in it or using it as a reason to be in the room without being required to participate, Evelyn couldn't entirely tell. Probably some of both. She had started telling stories. Not formally. She had not announced it, had not suggested it as a plan. It had happened by accident, more or less. Lucy had asked her one evening what Philadelphia was like, and Evelyn had described it, and then Lucy had asked what the funniest thing she had ever seen there was. And Evelyn had thought about it and told the story of the ice delivery man whose cart horse had developed an unexplained attraction to a particular millinery shop on Walnut Street and refused to pass it without investigation. And Lucy had laughed so hard she knocked the barn cat off her lap, which startled the cat and woke the kittens, which produced a chain of events that took several minutes to resolve. After that, stories were simply part of what the evenings were. She tried to keep them varied. Funny ones, strange ones, ones about places she had been, or people she had known, or things she had read. She told them to Lucy, ostensibly, because Lucy asked for them directly. But she was aware, without making anything of it, that the geography book had gone unreferenced on several evenings, that Caleb's pen sometimes stopped moving, that the particular quality of attention in the room had a shape to it. One night she told a story about crossing the plains on the train. A man in the car, who had been transporting a crate of live chickens and whose management of the situation had declined steadily over the course of 400 miles. It was a good story, better in the telling than it had been in the living, and she found the rhythm of it and let it go where it wanted to. When she finished, Caleb looked up from his ledger. His mouth had the careful shape of a man who has been trying not to smile for the last several minutes. 400 miles, he said. 400 miles, she confirmed. He shook his head and looked back down at the ledger, but the careful shape stayed on his mouth. Noah said nothing. But he had put the geography book down. She did not make a thing of it. What she was doing, she understood, was not charming the Hawthorne family into accepting her. Charm was the wrong instrument for this. What she was doing was more like the garden work, turning the soil, clearing out what had gotten compacted and lifeless, making the ground capable of receiving something again. It was slow. It was unglamorous. There were days when she felt she had made no progress at all. Days when Noah was colder than he had been the day before, and Caleb retreated into himself in ways she couldn't follow. Days when the sheer size of this family's grief pressed down on her like the Wyoming sky pressing down on the flat plain, enormous and indifferent. On one of those days, she did something she hadn't planned to do. She sat down at the kitchen table in the middle of the afternoon with a piece of paper and wrote a letter to her friend Clara, who was still in Philadelphia. She wrote about the ranch and the land and the particular quality of the light in late afternoon, the way it came across the grass in a way that had no equivalent back east. She wrote about Lucy and the braids. She wrote about Noah without saying much about him. There wasn't much she could say that was fair to him, yet. She wrote about Caleb in careful, honest language. He is a decent man who is still very far inside his loss, and I don't yet know what that means for the two of us, but I don't think decency is a small thing. She did not write, "I'm not sure I'm equal to this." But she thought it. She folded the letter and addressed it and left it on the shelf by the door where the mail things were kept, and Caleb took it to town without being asked, which meant he had seen it, and she thought that was its own kind of small acknowledgement. "I see you are still connected to a life before this one, and I will not pretend you are not." The trouble with Noah came to a head on a Wednesday in the 4th week, not because of anything dramatic, but because of a pie. She had made an apple pie from the dried apples she had found stored in the pantry, because the nights were getting colder and the dried apples needed using before the moisture got to them. It was a decent pie. Not her best. The dried apples made the texture different from fresh, but decent. She had put it on the windowsill to cool in the way she had been taught. She came back to find a wedge missing. She looked at the pie and then she looked at Lucy, who was sitting on the kitchen floor with a kitten and had the expression of someone who is concentrating very hard on not having an expression. "Lucy," she said. "It smelled very good," Lucy said. "Did you take a piece?" "I was going to tell you." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "Next time ask first," she said, "not after." "Yes, ma'am." Lucy looked genuinely contrite, which was its own reward. That evening at supper, there were 4 pieces of pie, which meant everyone got one, which meant nothing needed to be said about the missing piece, and nothing was. Lucy ate her piece with the particular focus of someone eating something that has cost them something, which seemed appropriate, and Evelyn caught Caleb watching this with the ghost of something fond in his eyes. But afterward, when Evelyn was washing up, Noah came into the kitchen and stood by the table with his hands in his pockets. "She does that," he said. "Takes things first and asks after." "I noticed," Evelyn said. "Mama used to get after her about it." There was the name again. This time Noah had put it there himself, which was different. "I imagine she did," Evelyn said. She kept washing, kept her eyes on the pot. "It's not that she's bad," Noah said, with the particular urgency of a boy who does not want his sister misjudged. She doesn't think ahead." "She's 6, Evelyn said. "Thinking ahead is something you learn." "She's 7. 7? Evelyn corrected herself. "I'll remember that." Noah was quiet for a moment. She could feel him still standing there, working through something. "The pie was good," he said finally. He said it like it cost him. She heard that. "Thank you," she said. He left before she could say anything else, which was fine. It was enough. It was more than enough, in fact. It was the most voluntary thing he had offered her since she arrived, and she stood at the sink and felt it land in her chest like something warm, and kept washing the pot with steady hands. She told no one. There was no one to tell, and besides, it was his to keep, that small, reluctant gift. By the 5th week, Caleb's walls were not down. She would not have described them as down, but they had, in places, developed something like windows. Moments where he looked at her directly, and she could see that there was a man in there who was not entirely made of grief, who had opinions about things and a dry sense of humor he mostly kept to himself, and a capacity for care he was still trying to figure out how to aim. He had started telling her things about the ranch in the evenings, not in the way of a man reporting to his employer, but in the way of a man talking through what was on his mind. The north fence was going to need replacing before spring. He was considering adding a second water trough by the east pasture. He had heard from the feed merchant in town that prices were likely to go up come January, and he was thinking about how to adjust for that. She asked questions. She didn't know enough about ranching to ask informed questions, but she could ask honest ones, and she found that he seemed to appreciate that someone was listening without already knowing the answers. His wife, she gathered, had been knowledgeable about the ranch. He was used to consulting a partner. He had been without one for 2 years. She was careful not to overreach. She gave opinions when he seemed to want them, and held them back when he seemed to be working something out in his own time. She had learned, somewhere in the years before this one, that the most useful thing you can sometimes do for a person is not solve their problem, but stand close enough that they don't feel alone while they solve it themselves. It was on a Thursday evening, 5 weeks and 2 days after her arrival, that Caleb said something she had not expected. They were on the porch. It was cold, properly cold now. The first cold that felt like a statement from the season, rather than a suggestion. She had her coat on and her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she was using primarily as a heat source. He was in his jacket, with his hands in his pockets, and they had been sitting there for a while in the particular comfortable silence they had slowly, almost without noticing, built between them. "You fixed the shutter," he said. "Weeks ago," she said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I'd been meaning to do it." It was a simple fix. "I'd been meaning to for almost a year," he said. "There were things I'd been meaning to do. The shutter, the curtain, the fence post by the garden." He stopped. "I couldn't." She didn't say anything. "I don't know if you understand what I'm—" He stopped again. "You don't have to explain it," she said. "I'm trying to say thank you," he said. He sounded faintly frustrated with himself, the way people do when the right words keep arriving in the wrong order. "I'm not doing a very good job of it." "You're doing fine," she said. He looked at her then, actually looked, in the direct way he rarely permitted himself, and she looked back, and it was not romantic. It was something more complicated than that, something that had to do with two people who had both been alone in different ways, recognizing each other across the distance. "I don't know how this works," he said. "I want to say that plainly. I signed the papers and I meant to honor them, but I don't know what I'm capable of, beyond that right now. I think that's fair to tell you." "It is," she said. "And that's all right? With you?" She considered the question honestly because it deserved honesty. "I didn't come here expecting something easy," she said. "I came here because the letter seemed honest, and I needed somewhere real to be. That's still true." She looked out at the dark yard. "I'll take honest and difficult over smooth and false, any day of my life." He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "Margaret would have liked you. She didn't know what to do with that. She thought that maybe she didn't need to do anything with it, just receive it." "Thank you," she said. They sat in the cold a while longer and then went inside, and the house was dark and quiet, and the kittens made small sounds from their box by the stove, and Evelyn went upstairs and lay down on the stiff linens that had slowly, over 5 weeks, begun to feel like her own. The hardest day of that month came not with a scene or a confrontation, but quietly, as the hardest things tend to. She had been in the garden plot, still turning it, still working the soil against spring, and she had looked up to see Noah standing at the fence line watching her, and there had been something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not the flat refusal she had grown accustomed to. It was something open and frightened and very young, and it disappeared as soon as he saw her looking. He turned and walked away. She sat back on her heels in the turned soil and looked at the empty space where he had been, and she thought, "He is 12 years old, and he watched his mother die, and he has decided that loving anything is a risk he cannot afford." She understood with the clarity that made her chest ache that there was nothing she could do about that directly. She couldn't argue him out of it. She couldn't fill the specific shape of what he had lost. She could only stay present, day after day, until presence itself became a kind of evidence. Evidence that not everyone who mattered left, that not all love was something you eventually had to grieve. She picked up the trowel and went back to work. That was the thing about the frontier that she had not understood from the letters, from the outside, from the Philadelphia life she had known. Out here, survival was not a single dramatic act. It was 1,000 ordinary ones, done in sequence, without applause, on days when the cold was sharp and the work was hard, and the people around you were still learning whether they could trust you. She was learning to be equal to that. She was not sure yet that she was. But she turned the soil, and she made the biscuits, and she told the stories, and she sat on the cold porch, and she held the territory she had gained without demanding more than she had earned. And she thought, this is the work. This is what staying looks like. The evening after she saw Noah at the fence line, he came to supper and sat down and ate without the particular quality of silence that meant he was refusing something. It was a small thing. She did not comment on it. But when she passed him the bread, he said, "Thank you," without being prompted, and Lucy looked up with wide eyes at this, as though a small meteorological event had occurred. And Caleb looked at his plate with the careful expression of a man who is not going to say anything because some things are too delicate for commentary. Evelyn handed Noah the butter and asked him what he thought about the north fence, because Caleb had mentioned it at supper 2 days ago, and she was genuinely curious whether Noah had an opinion. He did. He had quite a strong opinion, as it turned out. Specific, informed, based on his own observation of where the posts had gone soft and where the terrain was going to make replacement difficult. He talked about it for 4 minutes, which was more words than she had heard from him in any single stretch since she arrived. Caleb listened. He didn't interrupt. At the end he said, "I was thinking the same about the east section." Noah nodded, as though this confirmed something, and they talked about the fence, father and son, across the table, in the normal working way of a family that has things to discuss. And Evelyn ate her supper, and Lucy told the kittens about the fence too, in a whispered side conversation that nobody acknowledged, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the Wyoming night was vast and cold and indifferent, and in here they were 5 weeks into something that was still fragile and still imperfect, and still cost everyone something daily. But they were in here, and that was not nothing. The north fence took 4 days to replace. Caleb and Noah went out together each morning after breakfast, loading the wagon with posts and wire and the tools to drive them, and they came back each evening with their hands raw and their boots caked in the particular mud that forms where the water table is too close to the surface. Evelyn watched them come in, watched Noah climb down from the wagon with the slightly exaggerated weariness of a boy who wants credit for the difficulty of the day but doesn't want to ask for it directly. And she had supper ready, and she asked the kind of questions that meant she was paying attention without making anyone feel observed. By the 3rd day, Noah had started answering before she finished asking. That was something. She added it to the quiet list she kept in her head. Not a tally exactly, more like landmarks. Small fixed points she could locate herself by when she felt the ground shifting. The mornings had taken on their own character. Lucy was reliably, enthusiastically present in the kitchen by the time Evelyn had the stove lit, and their time before breakfast had become a loose and wandering thing, half cooking, half conversation, frequently derailed by the kittens, who had now been named Biscuit, Pepper, General, and the Duchess, the last of which Lucy had insisted upon for reasons she could not fully articulate but felt strongly about. "The Duchess doesn't like mornings," Lucy reported one Tuesday, holding the relevant kitten up for inspection. The Duchess had an expression of profound dissatisfaction, which seemed less a personality trait and more the general default expression of cats. "Some people are like that," Evelyn said. "Are you?" "Not particularly. I've always been better in the morning than at night." Lucy considered this. "Noah is terrible in the morning. I've noticed. Mama used to say he was born facing the wrong direction and never quite recovered." Evelyn glanced at her. Lucy had said it naturally, easily, the way you reference someone who is part of the furniture of your life, not with the careful handling that the subject of Margaret usually required in this house. It was such a simple, affectionate thing, and it landed in the kitchen between them without weight, without grief, just present, and Evelyn understood that Lucy still carried her mother in ordinary moments in a way that had not yet been broken by the specific pressure grief applies over time. She was not sure Noah still had that, and she was not sure Caleb did either. She sounds like she had a good way with words, Evelyn said. She was funny, Lucy said simply. Not like jokes, just the way she said things. I'd like to have known her, Evelyn said. It was an honest thing to say, and she said it honestly. And Lucy looked at her with those wide, assessing eyes and then nodded once, as though something had been submitted and accepted. The fence came in finished on a Thursday, and that evening Caleb sat down to supper with the particular quality of tiredness that comes from completing something, a tiredness that has satisfaction in it, different from the tiredness of ongoing labor. He ate more than he usually did. At the end of the meal, he looked at Noah across the table and said, "Good work this week." And Noah looked at his plate and said, "Yeah," but his ears went slightly red, which was enough. Evelyn had made a cake, not for any particular occasion. She had simply had the butter and the sugar and the time, and it seemed like the right thing for the end of a hard week's work. It was a plain yellow cake with a glaze of the remaining wild plum preserves, which were nearly gone now, which meant she needed to find out whether there were more somewhere or whether this was the last of them. "Where did the preserves come from?" she asked Caleb, while Lucy was examining her cake slice with the thoroughness of a property assessor. "Mrs. Aldine," he said. "In town. She gives us a jar every August." "She's very old," Lucy said without looking up from the cake. "She has a cat too, but her cat is mean." "She's not that old," Caleb said. "She's extremely old," Lucy said with confidence. Noah said, to no one in particular, "She's maybe 60. "That is extremely old," Lucy maintained. Caleb looked at Evelyn with an expression that said he had had this conversation before and had stopped mounting any serious defense. She bit the inside of her cheek to keep her face neutral. "Could I meet her?" Evelyn asked. "When I go to town?" "She'd like that," Caleb said. "She asks about things." "What kind of things?" He looked slightly uncomfortable. "You," he said. "How you're settling in." "Small towns," Evelyn said. "Yes," he said, without apology. She didn't need one. She had known she would be a topic of conversation in Harlan's Crossing from the moment she married a man the town already knew. She was the variable, the new element introduced into an established equation. That she was being discussed was inevitable. What they said could be addressed in time, when she had earned something to stand on. But the town could wait. The ranch was what mattered now. That was a Thursday. What happened on the following Saturday night she had not anticipated, and would not have been able to, and it came at her from the direction she was least prepared for. She had been asleep for perhaps 2 hours when the sound reached her. Not crying this time. This was something else. A high, desperate sound, the kind that comes from very deep in the chest and has no dignity in it, because dignity has been completely overtaken by terror. She was upright before she was fully awake. She was in the hallway before she had registered the location of the sound. She was through Lucy's door in the next moment and found the girl sitting straight up in bed, her eyes open but not seeing, her small fists gripping the blanket with a force that turned her knuckles white. "Lucy," she said. "Lucy, I'm here." The girl didn't respond. Her breathing was the quick, shallow kind that means the body has taken over from the mind. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and put a hand on her arm and said her name again. And the third time Lucy blinked and the eyes came back into focus, and she looked at Evelyn with a wild, unmoored expression, and then she broke. She broke completely, the way only children can. Totally, without reservation, with her whole self. She grabbed Evelyn's arm and she sobbed, and the sobbing had a texture to it, a specific, desperate quality that Evelyn couldn't immediately identify, and she put her arms around the girl and held her and said nothing because there was nothing yet to say, and let her cry. Caleb appeared in the doorway within a minute. He had clearly come from sleep. His hair was disordered. His expression was the controlled alarm of a man trying to assess a situation before reacting. He looked at Lucy and then at Evelyn, and Evelyn gave a small shake of her head that meant, "Not yet. Let me find out what this is." He stayed in the doorway. It took several minutes for the crying to come down to the level where words were possible. Even then, Lucy had to make 2 attempts at it, her breath hitching in the way that happens after serious crying when the body doesn't quite believe the emergency is over. "I can't remember her face," she said. Evelyn went still. "Mama's face," Lucy said. "I was trying to see her face and I couldn't. I tried to remember and it kept going away." She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, as though she could push the image back into place by force. I could remember her hands. I could remember her hands, but not her face. Behind Evelyn, in the doorway, she heard Caleb take a breath that had something ragged in it. "Lucy," she said carefully, "look at me." Lucy looked at her. "That is a very frightening thing to feel," she said. "I understand why it scared you, but losing the picture in your head, that isn't the same as losing her. The picture and the person are different things." "But what if I forget?" Lucy said. "What if I forget more?" "What do you remember about her hands?" Lucy blinked at the change of direction. "Her... what?" "You said you could remember her hands. Tell me about them." A trembling breath. "They were... She had a scar on her right thumb from when she was a girl. She cut it on a fence, and she smelled like the lavender soap she kept in the washstand drawer." "Good," Evelyn said, and she meant it. "That's real. That's yours." "But her face..." "We'll find her face," Evelyn said. "Somewhere in this house there is something with her likeness on it, and if there isn't, people who knew her will describe her. Her face is not gone. It's just not inside your head where you're looking for it right now, at 2 in the morning when you're frightened. That's not the same thing." Lucy's breathing was slowing. She was looking at Evelyn with the focus of someone trying very hard to believe something they very much want to be true. "How do you know?" Lucy said. "Because you remembered her hands," Evelyn said. "You remembered the scar and the lavender soap. Memory doesn't work the way we want it to. It doesn't file everything neatly where we can reach it. Things come back when you're not forcing them. You woke from a nightmare, in the dark, afraid. That's not when she's going to be easiest to find." "Evelyn," said a voice from the doorway. She turned. It was Noah. He was standing just behind his father, and his face was... She had never seen his face like this. The wall was completely down. He looked like what he was, a 12-year-old boy who had just heard his sister say the thing he himself had been most afraid of for 2 years in private. "The portrait," he said. "There's a portrait in Papa's room. In the trunk." Caleb turned to look at him. "I know where she keeps it," Noah said, and then stopped, and something went through his face when he heard his own verb tense. "Where he keeps it," he corrected quietly. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Caleb said, "I'll get it." He went down the hall. They heard the sound of his bedroom door, then a trunk being opened, then a silence that lasted longer than the search should have taken, then his footsteps coming back. He came into the room and handed the portrait to Lucy without speaking. It was a small, oval thing in a wooden frame, a painted miniature, the kind that costs what a working rancher saves for, done in the colors that miniatures of that era used, a little stylized, but real enough. A woman with dark hair and a direct gaze and something around the mouth that was clearly the origin of Noah's controlled expression. Lucy looked at it for a long time without speaking. "There she is," she said finally. "There she is," Caleb said. His voice was level, but barely. Lucy held the portrait in both hands and looked at her mother's face, and the last of the desperate crying settled out of her, replaced by something quieter and more workable. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up at Caleb. "Can I keep it for tonight?" "Yes," he said. She lay back down with the portrait held against her chest. Evelyn pulled the blanket up and smoothed it, and Lucy's eyes were already going heavy with the particular exhaustion that comes after. "Don't go yet," Lucy said. "I won't," Evelyn said. "Go to sleep." The girl's eyes closed. Her breathing evened out within a few minutes. Caleb stood for a moment more in the room, looking at his daughter, and then he moved quietly out into the hallway. Evelyn stayed. She sat on the edge of Lucy's bed in the dark and listened to the girl breathe and thought about what had just happened, about the particular quality of Lucy's panic, which had been not just the grief of losing someone, but the specific grief of losing the inside knowledge of them, the fear that memory is not a repository, but a fire, always going out, always needing to be fed. She understood that fear. When her mother died 5 years ago in Philadelphia, the first thing Evelyn had noticed afterward was how many ordinary facts about her she did not know. Small things. Whether her mother had preferred spring or autumn, what she had wanted to be when she was young, whether the stories she told about her own childhood were accurate or improved over time. She had not known those things because you never know them while the person is still alive, because you assume you will have time, because the time always seems like it's there until it isn't. She sat in the dark with this thought for a while. Then she heard, from the hallway, voices, low and not quite steady. She couldn't make out the words at first. Then she could. It was Noah's voice. "I thought it was just me," he was saying. "I thought I was the only one who was..." I keep trying to remember what she sounded like when she was just talking normal. Not laughing, not upset, just regular. And sometimes I can hear it, and sometimes I can't. Caleb's voice, lower. "I know. I didn't want to say it because, I don't know, I thought if I said it out loud it would get worse." A silence. Then Caleb, "It doesn't. I found it doesn't." "Does it go away? The not remembering?" "Parts of it," Caleb said, after a moment. "But I find things come back. Something will happen. A smell, or a sound, or something Lucy does. And there she is, clear as anything. You can't find it by looking. It comes when it comes." Noah was quiet for so long that Evelyn thought he might have gone to his room. Then, "I'm scared of forgetting her." "I know," Caleb said. "So am I." "Every day?" "Most days." Another silence. "Does it get smaller?" "Not smaller," Caleb said slowly, as though working it out while saying it. "Just, you get bigger around it, if that makes sense. The thing itself doesn't change. You just get larger than you were, over time, so it takes up less of the whole space." She heard Noah breathe. "I don't feel very large right now." "No," Caleb said. "You're 12. There's time." She heard the quiet shift of Caleb putting his hand on his son's shoulder, or what she interpreted as that, a change in the texture of the silence. Then footsteps, and Noah going back to his room, and Caleb standing in the hall for a moment longer before going back to his own. Evelyn sat in the dark and did not move for a long time. What she had just heard, that conversation between a father and his son, stripped of everything that was not essential, honest in the way that exhausted people in the middle of the night are honest, she felt it settle into her like something she had needed without knowing she needed it. Not because it was about her, because it wasn't, but because it was real in a way that so few things in this world are permitted to be real, and she had been let close enough to hear it. In the morning, she was going to suggest something that she knew could go wrong. She was turning it over already, in the back of her mind. The shape of it, the risks. But she would wait until morning. Lucy was asleep and Caleb had gone to bed and the house was quiet. And she sat with the sleeping girl a while longer and listened to the Wyoming dark, and let the idea take form. She said it at breakfast. She had thought about when, had considered the porch in the evening, or a private conversation with Caleb first, but in the end she thought the table was right. The table was where they were all present, where things had weight. "I want to suggest something," she said, "and I want you to hear it out before you decide." Caleb looked at her. Noah had stopped moving his fork. "I think we should talk about Margaret," she said, "not around things, not the way we've been doing, where we mention her and then the room goes quiet because nobody knows what to do with it. I mean, actually talk about her. Tell stories. The real ones, the specific ones. Lucy, last night you remembered her hands and the lavender soap, and I want to know more than that. I want to know who she was." Lucy was looking at her with very wide eyes. Caleb's face had gone still in the way it did when he was working through something he hadn't expected to have to work through. "You don't have to," Evelyn continued. "I'm not pushing. But the way I see it, the only way to keep her from going away is to keep talking about her. Stories hold people. That's what stories are for. And if you're afraid of forgetting, then the thing to do is not to stop mentioning her to protect yourselves, but to talk about her more, so what you know stays alive." The table was very quiet. Then Lucy said, "She used to sing when she thought no one was listening. She had a terrible voice." Caleb made a sound. It took Evelyn a second to identify it as a laugh. Short, startled, genuine. "She knew it too," he said. "She just didn't care." "What did she sing?" Evelyn asked. "Old songs," Lucy said. "Songs she learned when she was little. She'd sing them while she was hanging the laundry, and then if you walked around the corner and she saw you, she'd pretend she was just humming." "She could never actually just hum," Caleb said. "She'd start humming, and within 30 seconds there were words." Noah had not spoken. Evelyn didn't push it. She watched him from the edge of her attention and kept the conversation going with Caleb and Lucy, asking questions, drawing things out. The way Margaret had organized the pantry with a system nobody else fully understood. The way she had an opinion about horses that bordered on personal. The way she had once spent an entire evening arguing with a mail-order catalog, as though the catalog could hear her. She sent 3 letters to the catalog, Caleb said. In the end, they refunded her and sent a different item, and she kept both. Did she feel bad about that? Lucy asked. She felt excellent about it, Caleb said. She displayed it. Lucy dissolved into giggles. And then, quietly, without announcement, she used to read to me at night, Noah said. Everyone at the table adjusted slightly without being obvious about it. She'd do the voices, he said. Different voices for each character, even in the boring parts. Even if there were like 8 characters, she'd have a different voice for all of them, and she'd keep them straight the whole book. He was looking at his plate. I used to pretend I was too old for it because I thought I was supposed to, but she kept doing it. And I didn't actually stop listening. Caleb was looking at his son with an expression Evelyn could not name. Something soft and complicated, the look of a man seeing something he thought he'd lost. She knew, Caleb said quietly. She always knew. Noah's jaw moved. He picked up his fork and took a bite and didn't say anything else for a while. But something had changed in how he was sitting. A loosening, barely perceptible, like a knot that has been pulled 1 degree less tight. The next several days were different, not transformed. She was never going to claim the word transformed, because the grief was still there, and the difficulty was still there, and nothing was resolved. But something had been opened that had been sealed, and open was better than sealed, and the evenings began to hold a new quality. They talked about Margaret, not every night, not formally, but the way you talk about someone who is part of the house, naturally when something brought her up, which increasingly things did. Lucy would remember something and say so. Caleb would mention how Margaret had handled a particular ranch problem, not as a way of saying Evelyn was doing it wrong, but as a way of sharing a piece of his life that had been sealed away. Even Noah, slowly, began to offer things. Small specifics offered quietly, in the way he offered most things, as though he wanted them to land without too much ceremony. It was on a Wednesday evening, the second week after the Saturday nightmare, that Evelyn found the letters. She had not been looking for them. She had been helping Lucy locate a missing boot, the search for which had taken them behind the cedar chest in the main room, where a gap between the chest and the wall had become a repository for lost small items. And she had found, jammed behind the chest where it had slid and been forgotten, a bundle of envelopes tied with a piece of kitchen twine. She looked at them for a moment. The handwriting on the top envelope was a woman's, from the address. It was correspondence Margaret had sent to someone in Missouri, returned to sender, probably 2 years ago, which meant they had gone out after she died and come back and somehow ended up here, behind the chest, in the way that things end up in places during the particular chaos of early grief. She took them to Caleb. She found him in the barn, working on a piece of tack, and she held them out without preamble. He looked at them for a moment without taking them. Then he took them and looked at the handwriting, and his face did the thing it did. The controlled, swallowing quality. She wrote letters all the time, he said. I didn't know some had gone out after. He turned the bundle over in his hands. Where were they? Behind the cedar chest. I think they fell. He nodded. He set the bundle carefully on the workbench, not opening it, just present with it. Thank you for bringing them. She turned to go. Evelyn? She stopped. What you said at breakfast, he said. The thing about talking about her. He was looking at the bundle of letters. I had a minister tell me after she died that letting go was how you honored someone, that holding on too hard was a kind of selfishness. She waited. I don't think that's right, he said. I've been thinking about it, and I don't think that's right. No, she said. I don't think it is either. He was quiet for a moment. She's not going anywhere as long as we keep talking about her. That's right, Evelyn said. He picked up the tack and went back to working on it, and she went back to the house, and the sky outside was the particular late afternoon color that the Wyoming sky gets in autumn, that specific shade between amber and gray that has no good name in English. And she walked through it back to the house where Lucy was waiting with one boot located and the other still missing, and the evening came on, and the family sat down to supper. And Margaret Hawthorne was present at that table in the only way the dead can be present, in the specific, particular, irreplaceable knowledge held by the people who had loved her. And that was not nothing. That was, Evelyn thought, everything. It was 2 days after that when Noah came to her in the kitchen, not drifting through, not pausing at the doorway. He came in and stood at the table and waited until she turned around, which meant he had a thing to say and had decided to say it. "Yes," she said. "The portrait," he said. "Lucy still has it, in her room." "I know. I think—" He stopped, started again. "There should probably be more pictures, or something, more things where she can see them." He was working to keep his voice level in the way that people do when they are saying something that matters more than they want it to. "I know that might be— I don't know how you feel about that, having her pictures around." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "I think that's a good idea," she said. He blinked. "She lived here," Evelyn said. "This was her house, her family. The pictures should be where you can see them." She paused. "I'm not trying to replace her, Noah. I want you to know that clearly. I couldn't if I tried. What I'm trying to do is make this house somewhere your family can live again, and that means she's part of it, not hidden in a trunk." He looked at her for a long moment, a very long moment. She held it. "Okay," he said. Just the one word, but he said it like he meant it, and he had said it to her face, and that was something Evelyn would carry with her for a long time afterward. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. Because it was the plain, simple word of a boy who had just, quietly, decided to trust her with something real. He left the kitchen. She turned back to the stove. Her hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. She waited until they were, and then she went on with supper. The portrait of Margaret Hawthorne went up on the wall beside the main room window on a Thursday morning, and nobody made a ceremony of it. That was Evelyn's choice. She had thought about it, had considered whether there should be some acknowledgement, some gathering of the family, some intentional moment. She had decided against it. Making it into an occasion would have put pressure on everyone to feel the right thing at the right time, and grief does not perform on schedule. So she asked Caleb simply whether he had a nail and a hammer, and he had looked at her for a moment and then gone to get them. And he had driven the nail himself, and she had handed him the portrait, and he had hung it. He stepped back and looked at it for a long time. "She'd say it was crooked," he said. Evelyn looked. It was, very slightly. She adjusted it. "Better," Caleb said. He stood there another moment, and then he went outside, because there are limits to how much a person can hold in one standing still, and he had reached his. Lucy discovered it after breakfast and stood in front of it for several minutes without speaking, the way she sometimes stood in front of things she was taking seriously. Then she said, to no one in particular, "She looks like she's about to say something funny," and went to find the Duchess, which was as complete an endorsement as any painting could hope to receive from a 7-year-old. Noah saw it when he came in from the morning chores. He stopped in the doorway to the main room and looked at it, and Evelyn was in the kitchen and could see him from the corner of her eye. He stood there for a while. Then he straightened up and came into the kitchen and poured himself a cup of water from the pitcher and drank it. And when he set the cup down, he said, without turning around, "It's a good place for it. She liked that window." "I thought she might have," Evelyn said. He turned then and looked at her directly, and she saw something in his face that she hadn't seen before. Not the closed, weathered expression she had grown accustomed to, but something more like the face of a boy who has put down something heavy and is still figuring out what to do with his hands. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. "You're welcome." He went back outside, and she stood in the kitchen and thought, there it is again. That word from him which cost him something each time, in which he had now given twice. She did not make more of it than it was, but she did not make less of it either. October came in cold and serious, the way Wyoming October does, not easing into it, not giving you the gradual transition of the eastern seasons, but arriving one morning fully formed, with a frost on the ground and a sky the color of old pewter and a wind off the north that meant business. Caleb put extra wood in before the freeze, and Noah helped him stack it, and Evelyn put up the heavier curtains she had found in the storage chest, and the house contracted into itself the way houses do when the season turns, becoming smaller and warmer and more necessary. There was a trip to town in the first week of October, which Evelyn had been preparing for without quite announcing she was preparing for it. She had a list. Not a dramatic list, just the practical accumulation of 2 months of noticing what was needed and what was running low. Flour, salt, lamp oil, a new set of jar rings for the preserving she intended to do before winter closed in fully, thread in 3 colors. She had also written to Clara in Philadelphia again, and there was the question of the return letter, whether it had arrived at the post office. Caleb hitched the wagon early. Lucy was coming because she always came to town, regarding it as a right rather than a privilege. Noah stayed behind to check the cattle, which was a legitimate job, and also, Evelyn suspected, his preferred relationship with Harlan's Crossing, acquaintance rather than engagement. The town was smaller than it had looked in her imagination during the months of correspondence. Most frontier towns were, she was learning. They existed at a scale that felt provisional, as though they were still deciding whether they were permanent. Harlan's Crossing had a main street of packed dirt with a general store, a post office that shared a building with the land registry, a feed merchant, a livery, a barber, 2 establishments she didn't go near, and a collection of smaller buildings arranged without much planning behind the main face. The people, though, were real enough. Mrs. Aldine was exactly as old as Lucy had implied, and exactly as direct as the jar of preserves had suggested. She intercepted them at the general store with the confidence of a woman who had decided long ago that social niceties were other people's problem, took one long look at Evelyn, and said, "You're sturdier than I expected." "I'll take that as a compliment," Evelyn said. "It is one," Mrs. Aldine said. "I've seen 3 mail-order brides in this county in 15 years. One went back east inside a month. One had a complete nervous collapse by Christmas. The third one's still here, but she cries every Sunday regular as a clock." She examined Evelyn with the detached thoroughness of someone appraising livestock. "You don't look like a crier." "I cry when it's warranted," Evelyn said. Mrs. Aldine smiled at this, a quick, genuine smile that reorganized her whole face. "Good answer," she said. "Come for tea Thursday. I'll tell you everything useful about this town, which will take about 20 minutes, and everything interesting, which will take considerably longer." "I'll be there," Evelyn said. She was, and Mrs. Aldine was accurate on both counts. The useful information included which families were trustworthy for trade, which feed merchant measured short if you didn't watch, and the precise social geography of who did not speak to whom and why, which in a town of this size was important navigation. The interesting information included 60 years of accumulated local history delivered with the editorial commentary of a woman who had outlived everyone who might have objected to her opinions. What Evelyn valued most, though, was something Mrs. Aldine said near the end of the second cup of tea. "Caleb Hawthorne is a decent man who went somewhere dark after Margaret died," she said. "I don't say that as a criticism. She was his whole direction. Some people are built that way. They need to know which way they're facing, and she was that for him. After she was gone, he stopped moving forward. Not backward, mind you. He kept the ranch, kept the children fed, did what needed doing, but stopped moving forward." She looked at Evelyn over her cup. "He's moving forward again. People in town have noticed. I faut masinko besbots." "I haven't done much," Evelyn said. "You stayed," Mrs. Aldine said. "That's not nothing. That's not small either, depending on the circumstances." She set down her cup with the finality of a period at the end of a sentence. "Margaret would have liked you. Different type entirely, but she respected practical women." Evelyn thought of Caleb saying the same thing, on the porch in the cold. She wondered whether they had talked, Caleb and the old woman, or whether 2 people who knew the same person well simply arrived at the same conclusion independently. She did not ask. Some things are better left as they are. The letter from Clara was waiting at the post office, and she read it on the way home in the wagon, with the cold air coming off the plain and Lucy asleep against her shoulder, having exhausted herself through the sheer effort of having opinions about everything in the general store. Clara's letter was warm and funny and full of Philadelphia news, and at the end of it she said, "You sound like yourself, which is not how you sounded in January, and that is a very good sign." Evelyn folded it and put it in her coat pocket and looked out at the Wyoming plain, flat and enormous, the mountains very far off and going blue in the afternoon light. She had thought, in January, that she did not know what she was doing. She had thought it through February and into March. She had thought it getting on the train. She was not sure she had stopped thinking it exactly, But the quality of the uncertainty had changed. It had gone from the kind that paralyzes to the kind that simply accompanies you while you work. That was progress. She was willing to call it that. The harder work of October was the preserving, which she had not done at the scale this household required since she was a girl in her mother's kitchen, and she approached it with the combination of genuine intention and realistic humility. She had put up some tomatoes in September from what little the garden had produced in its late-season state. Not much, but a start. The squash had done better than she expected, given how late she had planted. There were apples to dry, and the beans needed putting up, and she had arranged through the general store for a crate of additional produce from a farm further east that had the surplus she lacked. Lucy was her primary assistant, which meant the operation was efficient in some respects and wildly inefficient in others. "Is this one good?" Lucy held up an apple that had one suspicious brown spot. "Cut the spot off, and it's fine." "What if the spot goes all the way through?" "Then we find out when you cut it." "And if it does?" "Then the chickens have a nice afternoon." Lucy considered this allocation of resources to be entirely reasonable and went after the apple with a paring knife, her tongue slightly out with concentration. She was getting better with the knife, which was a thing Evelyn had been deliberately working on, not rushing it, not making it a lesson with that word attached, just letting her practice with the understanding that competence was the point. Noah appeared in the kitchen doorway on the second afternoon of preserving to report that one of the jars from the previous year's stock in the cellar had cracked, and could Evelyn come look at whether the others were affected. This was a reasonable ranch question that required practical knowledge she was still building, so she went with him to the cellar and they looked at the shelves together, and she asked him questions and he answered them. And at some point they were simply two people solving a problem, which was its own kind of ordinary miracle. "These three look fine," he said, pointing to a cluster of jars in the far corner. "The seal's still good, but this whole row—" He indicated a shelf at eye level. "I don't trust them." "Your mother put these up?" Evelyn asked. She said it straightforwardly, without the particular careful handling the subject used to require. 2 years ago," he said, "the fall before she got sick." He looked at the jars. "She always said the light in the cellar ruined the color, but the flavor held. She was right about that." "She usually was, from what I hear." He almost smiled. Not quite, but the shape of it was there. "About the ranch stuff. Some other things she was just stubborn about." "What kind of things?" "Horses," he said. She had opinions about specific horses that weren't. She liked horses that most people didn't. Difficult ones. She said the easy horses were boring. He picked up one of the questionable jars and held it to the light coming from the cellar door above. "Papa still has one of them, the gray mare in the north paddock. She was Mama's." "That horse is terrifying," Evelyn said, because she had met the gray mare and the gray mare had made her opinions known. This time Noah actually smiled. It lasted about 2 seconds, which for him was generous. "She is," he agreed, "but she's real fast." They disposed of the questionable jars, and Evelyn made note of what would need replacing. And when they came up out of the cellar into the afternoon light, Noah held the door for her, which was such an ordinary piece of courtesy that it almost didn't register, except that it registered completely, because 6 weeks ago he would not have done that. She said nothing about it. She said, "Thank you," for the door and for the cellar, and went back to the preserving, and he went back to whatever he had been doing, and the afternoon continued. The first real test came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into October. It came in the form of a letter from Caleb's brother, whose name was Richard, and who lived in Kansas, and about whom Caleb had said very little except that they were not close. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and Caleb read it at the table after supper with his face doing the controlled swallowing thing, and then he put it down and sat there for a moment before folding it and putting it in his shirt pocket. "My brother is coming," he said. "When?" Evelyn asked. 2 weeks. He wants to see the ranch." He stopped. "He has a view that, after Margaret died, he suggested I sell, move to Kansas, be closer to family, let someone else take the land." "You didn't want to," Evelyn said. "No." "Does he know about me?" Caleb looked at her. "I wrote him in August, when the papers were done." He wrote back. A pause. It was not a warm letter. She absorbed this. "Is he coming to inspect the situation?" "That would be my assessment," Caleb said. "All right," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was hard to read. Not quite worried, not quite apologetic, somewhere in between. He's not an easy man. Neither were you when I got here, she said, and then she heard how that had come out and added, That's not a criticism, just an observation. Something moved across his face. It might have been amusement. Fair, he said. I can handle difficult, she said. I've been doing it for 2 months. What I need to know is what you want from this visit, what you want the outcome to be. He considered that. I want him to see that the ranch is sound and the children are well and that I've made a reasonable decision. Then that's what we'll show him, she said. He looked at her for a moment. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, she said, but it's clear. Clear is different from simple. He picked up his coffee cup and looked into it. Richard is going to ask you direct questions. He's going to be looking for reasons. Reasons for what? Reasons to think this was a mistake, Caleb said. He said it plainly, which she appreciated. He worries about the children. He thinks, after Margaret, he thinks I make decisions from grief rather than from judgment. And did you? She asked. With me. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, I made the decision from a place of being honest about what I was capable of and what the children needed. Whether that was grief or judgment, I'm not entirely sure those are separate things for me right now. That's an honest answer, she said. I'm trying to be honest, he said. I think you deserve that. She thought about the porch conversation weeks ago. I don't know what I'm capable of. And she thought about the portrait on the wall and the conversation with Noah in the cellar and Lucy's braid getting incrementally better each week and the letters she and Clara still exchanged and the stiff linens that felt like her own now. She thought about all of it, the whole imperfect accumulation. You've been honest, she said. That's not a small thing either. The 2 weeks before Richard's arrival were useful in a specific way. They gave the household something external to organize around, which has its own clarifying effect on the internal. Evelyn went through the house with fresh eyes, not to perform for the visitor, but because looking at things with fresh eyes is sometimes how you see what still needs doing. She finished the kitchen curtain she had been meaning to rehang. She repaired a hinge on the back door that had been dragging since she arrived. She turned the mattresses, which hadn't been done since she couldn't guess when. She also deliberately made sure Margaret's portrait stayed on the wall. She had thought about this. She had wondered whether Richard might read it as something, she wasn't sure what, but she had decided against removing it or moving it because this house was not a performance, and Margaret Hawthorne had lived here and raised her children here, and the portrait belonged on the wall, and anyone who was going to judge the household could judge it honestly. The night before Richard arrived, Evelyn had Lucy in the kitchen for what had become their regular Thursday baking. They were making oatmeal cookies, which was Lucy's current preference, and the girl had reached the stage where she could do most of the measuring herself with only occasional supervision. What is Uncle Richard like? Lucy asked, measuring out the oats with great seriousness. I've never met him, Evelyn said. He sent me a toy horse for my birthday last year, Lucy said, but it was for a younger child, I think. It was very small, and it didn't look like a real horse. She paused. I kept it anyway because it's not the horse's fault. That's generous of you. Do you think he'll like you? Evelyn considered the question honestly. I don't know, I hope so, but I'm not going to change how I do things to make him like me. I'll be polite and honest and do my work, and he'll make up his own mind. Lucy looked at her with those wide, assessing eyes. That's what Mama used to say. She said you can't make someone think well of you. You can only give them accurate information. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Your mother was right about that. She was right about a lot of things, Lucy said, and went back to measuring, and it was said with the particular ease of someone who has made peace with something, and Evelyn felt it as a fullness in her chest, not like grief, more like its opposite. Richard Hawthorne arrived on a Thursday afternoon on a hired horse from town, having taken the train to Cheyenne. He was 5 years older than Caleb and looked it, a broader, less weathered version of the same general construction, with a mustache Caleb didn't have and an air of assessment that he wore openly, without apology. He shook Evelyn's hand at the door and looked at her directly, the way someone does when they have been forming an opinion and are now checking it against reality. Mrs. Hawthorne, he said. Mr. Hawthorne, she said. Call me Richard. Evelyn, she said. He looked at the main room, at the portrait on the wall, and something moved across his face. Surprise, she thought, quickly controlled. He said nothing about it. Supper that evening was the most deliberately ordinary meal Evelyn had ever prepared, which meant it was exactly what she would have made on any other Thursday. A good pot roast with the vegetables from the cellar, bread she had made that morning, an apple cake because the apples were there and it was the right thing to do with them. Nothing performed, nothing elevated beyond what the household actually did. Richard ate well and asked questions about the ranch, range conditions, cattle numbers, plans for the spring, and Caleb answered them with the quiet, specific competence of a man who knows his land. Noah contributed to this conversation in a way he would not have been able to 2 months ago, not just answering when asked, but offering, at one point, his own observation about the water situation in the east pasture, which Richard received with visible surprise that he tried not to show. "You've got a good head for it," Richard told him. Noah said, "Papa taught me," and went back to his food. And Caleb looked at his plate and said nothing, but the muscle in his jaw was doing the thing it did when he was keeping something close. After supper, while Lucy was engaged in showing Richard the kittens, which she had decided was a fundamental orientation activity for any visitor to the ranch, Evelyn washed the dishes and listened to Caleb and Richard on the porch. She was not trying to hear them. The window was open because the evening was not as cold as it had been, and the voices came through it. "She's not what I expected," Richard said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone more—" He searched for the word. "Provisional." "She's not provisional," Caleb said. A silence. "No, I can see that." Another pause. "The children seem well." "They are. Lucy she seems better than the last time I saw her." "She is. And the boy. He's changed." "He's had a hard couple of years," Caleb said. "He's coming out of it." Richard was quiet for a moment. "I said some things in that letter." "You did. I was worried about you making a decision from the wrong place." "I know," Caleb said. "I wasn't." Another pause, longer this time. "I can see that now," Richard said. "I can see that more clearly than I expected to." Evelyn set a clean pot on the shelf and made a small amount of noise doing it. Not deliberately, but enough that if they could hear her, they would know she was there. And she went back to the washing without trying to hear what came next. She didn't need to hear what came next. She had heard enough. The difficult moment came, as difficult moments tend to, from an unexpected direction. It was the second morning of Richard's visit, and Evelyn had gone out to the garden plot after breakfast. Habit now, just checking on the winter preparations. And Richard had followed her out, which she had not expected. He stood at the fence of the garden plot with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched her check the beds, and she let him. And after a while he said, "Can I ask you something direct?" "Yes," she said. "Do you love my brother?" She looked at him. He met her gaze without flinching, which she respected. "Not the way you mean," she said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever in the way you mean. But I think that's an honest thing to say rather than a discouraging one." He waited. "I respect him," she said. "I think he's a good man who has been carrying more than he should have carried alone. I think his children are worth everything that's being asked of me, and more. And I think what's being built here, slowly, badly some days, better other days, is real." She looked back at the garden. "I didn't come here for romance. I came here because I needed somewhere real to put my life. And I think this is real. I think he is real. I think that's enough to build on." Richard was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Margaret married him for love." "I know," she said, "and that was right for her. This is right for me." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize. Not warm exactly, but something that was warming. "She'd have liked you," he said. "She had no patience for performance." "That's the second time someone has told me that," Evelyn said. "I'm starting to feel like she and I might have gotten along well." "You would have argued," he said. "She had opinions." "So do I." He made a sound that was nearly a laugh. "Yes," he said. "I can see that." He looked at the garden plot, at the turned soil, at the evidence of steady work. "You did all this?" The soil needed it, she said. Spring will be better for it. He nodded. He looked at the garden for another moment, and then he looked at her with the directness she had decided was simply how he was built. I came here expecting to have concerns, he said. I want to be honest with you about that. I know, she said. Caleb told me. And I still have some. Not about you specifically, about the whole situation. Whether it's the right thing for him, whether it's sustainable. Those are fair concerns, she said. I have some of my own. He looked slightly startled. You do? Of course, she said. I'm not certain either. I'm doing the work and paying attention and trying to be honest, and that's all anyone can do. She looked at him. If you're looking for certainty, I can't give you that. Nobody can. What I can tell you is that your brother is not alone anymore, and his children are not alone anymore, and that's what I can offer right now. Whether it becomes more is a matter of time and work and honest living. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once with the air of a man who has reached a conclusion he hadn't entirely expected to reach. All right, he said. He went back toward the house. She turned back to the garden. Her breath made small clouds in the October air. That evening, after supper, Noah did something she would not have anticipated 3 weeks ago, much less 2 months ago. He came to find her. She was in the main room, mending a shirt that had gone at the elbow, and he sat down in the chair across from her, which was the chair she had come to think of as simply an empty chair, and he picked up a book that had been sitting on the side table, and he read. He just sat there and read while she mended, and neither of them said anything for perhaps 40 minutes, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and she felt it as something extraordinary because she understood what it meant. He had chosen to be in the same room. Not because he was forced to, not because supper required it, not because Lucy needed hurting. He had simply decided that this was where he wanted to be. She kept her eyes on the mending and did not make any comment, and did not let the moment become a thing, because the moment was too important to make into a thing. But when she went upstairs that night, she sat on the edge of her bed. Her bed, she thought. It felt like her bed now. And she let herself feel it. The whole weight of the last 2 months, the work of it, the difficulty of it, the slow and imperfect and sometimes painful progress of it. And this evening, and Noah reading in the chair and Lucy's cookies on the kitchen shelf, and Richard's face when he looked at the garden, and Caleb's voice on the porch saying, she's not provisional. She didn't cry. She sat there in the quiet and she breathed, and she thought, this is what staying looks like, on the other side of the difficult part. She was not naive enough to think there was no more difficult part. She knew there was. She knew the distance between where they were and wherever they were going was still considerable, and that trust built slowly is also slow to be tested, and the testing would come in forms she couldn't predict. But tonight, Noah had sat in the chair, and that was enough to go to sleep on. Richard left on a Saturday morning the way he had arrived, on a hired horse, with his coat collar up against the October wind and his manner somewhat different from when he had come. He shook Caleb's hand at the gate and held it a beat longer than a routine farewell. He ruffled Lucy's hair, which she accepted with the tolerant air of someone who has decided to permit a thing without endorsing it. He looked at Noah and said, "You're going to be a good rancher." And Noah said, "I know," which made Richard's mouth do something that was clearly a suppressed laugh, and which made Caleb look away at the middle distance. Then Richard looked at Evelyn. "I'll write when I'm back," he said. "If that's all right." "I'd like that," she said, and meant it. He rode out down the track toward town, and the four of them stood at the gate and watched him go. And nobody said much, and then Lucy said she was cold and went inside, and Noah went to the barn, and Caleb and Evelyn stood there another moment in the way they had developed, comfortable in the same silence, not needing to fill it. "He approved," Caleb said. "Not a question." "More or less," she said. "More or less is Richard at his most enthusiastic," Caleb said. "Don't take it as a reservation." "I didn't," she said. He looked at the empty track for another moment. Then he said, "Thank you for what you said to him. In the garden. He told me." She looked at him. "He told you?" "He said—" Caleb stopped and started again in that careful way of his, making sure the words were the right ones before releasing them. "He said you were honest with him in a way he didn't expect. He said you didn't try to make it into something it wasn't. It seemed like the right approach with him," she said. "It was," Caleb said. He doesn't trust easy. He never has. He paused. I think he trusts you. She thought about that walk to the garden and Richard's direct question and how she had answered it without performance. Good, she said. They went inside and the house received them, and the morning went on. November came and the cold became a permanent condition rather than a visitor. The ranch contracted further into its winter rhythms. The work shorter in some ways because the ground was frozen and certain tasks suspended, and longer in others because the cattle needed more attention and the equipment needed winterizing and the wood needed to be where it was needed before the serious weather arrived. Caleb and Noah spent long days at it, coming in with the particular tiredness of men who have worked outside in cold air, which is different from any other tiredness. Evelyn found her own winter rhythm. The preserving was done. She had put up more than she had initially calculated, having underestimated her own capacity for it once she found the pace. The root cellar was organized in a way that made her quietly pleased, the shelves labeled in her own hand, the jars ranked by date, the space finally functioning the way a good cellar should. She had begun teaching Lucy to read more fluently, which Lucy's inconsistent formal schooling had left uneven, and they did this in the evenings at the kitchen table, Lucy's face going through 17 expressions per page, depending on what was happening in the text. She can't do that, Lucy said, about a character in the book they were working through. She can, Evelyn said. She does. It's a bad idea. Most of the interesting things in stories are bad ideas, Evelyn said. That's why they're interesting. Lucy considered this with the seriousness she brought to philosophical questions. Is that true in real life too? Sometimes, Evelyn said. Not always. Some of the best things are also very sensible. Like what? Evelyn thought about it honestly. Like putting the preserves up before the freeze, like turning soil that needs turning, like telling the truth to someone who needs to hear it even when it's complicated. Those aren't very exciting, Lucy said. No, Evelyn agreed, but they last. Lucy went back to the book, apparently having filed this away under things to think about later. The first real snowfall came in the second week of November, which the locals considered late for a good year and ordinary for any other. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window the morning it arrived and watched it come across the plain, watched the far mountains disappear into it first, then the ridge, then the barn resolving into a shape rather than a structure, the fence posts going white on top. She had seen snow her whole life in Philadelphia, but city snow is a different creature from this, pressed thin by buildings and traffic, soiled quickly, never quite achieving its own ambition. This snow had nothing interfering with it. It came down with intention and covered everything with complete, even honesty. Lucy came downstairs and stood beside her at the window. It's very white, Lucy said. It is. Mama used to make snow candy, Lucy said. She said it the way she said most things about Margaret now, as a simple fact, present rather than painful, carrying warmth rather than only weight. She'd boil the syrup and pour it on the fresh snow, and it would harden into strings. I know that, Evelyn said. My mother made it too. Lucy turned to look at her. Can you make it? I expect so, Evelyn said. If you'll go get the maple syrup from the back shelf. They made snow candy that morning, the two of them, with the first proper snowfall of the year coming down outside, and the syrup boiling on the stove, and Lucy stationed at the window to report on snow conditions with the gravity of a military observer. When it was ready, they went out together into the yard. Lucy in her coat and boots, Evelyn in her coat and the wool hat she had bought in town, and they poured the strings of syrup onto the clean snow on the porch railing and waited for them to set. Noah came out of the barn to see what was happening. He stood at the barn door for a moment, taking in the scene, and then he walked over without comment and crouched beside the railing to look at the cooling candy. Mama made this, he said. I know, Evelyn said. Lucy told me. He looked at the syrup strings for a moment. Then he reached out and tested one with a finger and pulled it free and ate it. He stood up and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was not guarded, that was simply open, a 12-year-old in the snow eating maple candy. Good, he said. There's more, she said. They stood on the porch in the snowfall and ate maple candy, all three of them, and when Caleb came around from the back of the barn and found them there, he stopped and looked at the scene, his son and daughter, and Evelyn standing in the snow with strings of maple candy. and whatever moved through his face was too complex for a single name. "Is there any left?" he asked. "Some," Lucy said, "but you have to be fast." He came up onto the porch and took a piece, and they stood there together in the falling snow and ate it, and no one said anything particularly meaningful, and that was exactly right. The thing about the weeks that followed, the deep November, the lead into December, was that they were not dramatic. Evelyn had learned over her months at the ranch that the dramatic moments were not where the real changes happened. The real changes happened in the accumulation of the ordinary, in suppers made and eaten, in chores completed, in the reading lessons and the morning braids that were genuinely good now, in the conversations at the kitchen table that ranged wherever they went without anyone managing them. The dramatic moments were markers, landmarks you could point to later and say, there, that was when something shifted. But the shifting itself happened in the daily unremarkable living. She thought about this on a Tuesday afternoon when she was alone in the house. Caleb and Noah both out, Lucy visiting Mrs. Aldine with the careful supervision of the wagon driver from the neighboring Pruitt farm, who made the trip to town weekly and had agreed to take her. The house was quiet in the way that a house is quiet when it is actually inhabited. Not empty, but resting. She sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and she looked at the room. The curtains she had rehung, the shelf she had reorganized, the new hinge on the back door that no longer dragged, the hook by the door where Caleb's coat hung and Noah's jacket hung below it, and Lucy's smaller coat hung at the end. The kittens in their box, smaller now, the box, because Biscuit and the Duchess had been moved to the barn per the original agreement, and only Pepper and General remained. General having proven his diplomacy with the other household animals, and Pepper having simply refused to leave. She sat in this room and she thought, I made some of this. Not all of it. Most of it was already here in the bones of the house and the character of the people who lived here. But some of it was hers, and the rest of it was different because she had been here to receive it and tend it and take it seriously. She had told Richard she had come looking for somewhere real to put her life. That had been honest. What she had not known when she said it was that the real place you put your life is not a location. It is the people who make a claim on your daily attention, who fill your ordinary hours with the weight of their needs and their particular ways of being in the world. You put your life into the people. She had put hers here, into this family, into this cold and enormous Wyoming plain, into the kittens and the snow candy and the portrait on the wall and the boy who had started coming to sit in the main room in the evenings and the girl whose braids were genuinely excellent now. Evelyn had told her so honestly because they were, and the man who said things carefully because he had learned that carelessly said things had consequences. She drank her tea and the house rested around her and she thought, I didn't know I was looking for this. But I was. The conversation with Caleb happened on a Friday evening in the first week of December, when the cold was serious and both children were in bed and the fire in the main room had burned down to steady coals. They had been sitting in companionable quiet, the kind that had become their established mode in the evenings, and Evelyn had been thinking about the letter she owed Clara, and Caleb had been looking at the fire, and then he said without preamble, I want to tell you something. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, not at her. This was how he said important things, she had learned, looking sideways at them rather than directly. When I wrote those letters, he said, the ones you answered, I wrote them honestly, but I held things back, because I thought if I told the whole of it, no one would come. The children, the grief, the state of things. I know, she said. I understood that when I got here. I should have told you more. Caleb, she said, if you had told me more, I might not have come, and then where would we be? He looked at her then. That doesn't bother you? That I wasn't fully honest? You weren't dishonest, she said. You were afraid. That's different. She held his gaze. I held things back too. About why I was really leaving. About how small my life had gotten. I wasn't sure you'd want someone who was running toward rather than away. Are those different? He asked. I think so, she said. I think running toward means you've decided on a direction. Running away just means you know what you can't stand. He thought about this. The fire settled in the grate. I think you were running toward, he said, for what it's worth, from what I've seen. Thank you, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'd like this to be real, not just an arrangement. I don't know the exact shape of what that means yet. I don't want to make promises I haven't figured out how to keep, but I want you to know that I'd like it to be real." She looked at him for a long moment. This man she had married on a Tuesday in a county clerk's office without knowing him, this man who said things carefully and drove fence posts in the cold and told his son that you get larger around the grief rather than smaller. And she felt something settle in her that had been held in a kind of readiness since she arrived. "I'd like that too," she said. "I think we're already further along than you're giving us credit for." He looked at the fire again. "Maybe," he said. He almost smiled. "You're harder to give credit to than you realize. You make things look like they were going to happen anyway." "Good," she said. "That means I'm doing it right." He did smile then, properly, for the first time in her presence in a way that reached all the way to his eyes, and it changed his face into something younger and quieter. And she thought, there he is, under all of it. There he has been all along. The snow came in hard in the second week of December. Serious snow, the kind that means the frontier is reminding you of its terms. The cattle needed breaking ice from the water troughs morning and evening. The horses needed extra feed. The paths between the house and the barn had to be kept clear, which was cold, relentless work. Caleb and Noah went out in it each morning wrapped to the eyes and came back each evening stamped free of it at the door. And Evelyn had something hot waiting, and the house warm and the children present. And this routine, this daily, ordinary, difficult routine, was the shape of their life, and it was a real shape, and it held. Noah's birthday fell in the third week of December, and Evelyn had been planning for it quietly, which meant she had not announced any plans but had been accumulating them. She made the cake he had mentioned once, in a peripheral kind of way. He had said, helping himself to a second piece of the yellow cake some weeks back, that his mother used to make a chocolate cake for his birthday, and that he supposed it was too much trouble to make. And she had said nothing in response and filed it. She found the recipe in a small, handwritten book she had discovered in the kitchen drawer in her first weeks at the ranch, Margaret's recipe book, which she had handled with the careful respect of something that belonged to someone else, and had used sparingly, only when she needed a specific piece of knowledge that it held. The chocolate cake was in it, written in the particular shorthand of someone who had made it enough times that full instructions felt unnecessary. She had to infer some quantities. She made 2 test batches before she was confident. On the morning of his birthday, she set it on the table before breakfast. Noah came downstairs and stopped. He looked at the cake, then at Evelyn. "Chocolate," he said. "Your mother's recipe," she said, "from her book. I hope I got it close." He looked at the cake for a long moment. He swallowed once, and she watched him work through whatever was moving through him, and she did not rush him or make it easier because some things need to be felt properly. "Thank you," he said. His voice was level, but it had cost something to be level, and she heard that. "Happy birthday, Noah," she said. At breakfast he had 2 pieces before the meal was done, which Caleb remarked on and Lucy considered fair given that it was his birthday. And the argument about this was cheerful and went nowhere, and was exactly the kind of breakfast the ranch had needed for a long time. That afternoon, Evelyn was outside clearing the path to the barn when Noah came out and took the second shovel from where it leaned against the wall without being asked. He started on the far end of the path, working toward her, and for a while the only sounds were the scrape of the shovels and the particular hush of a December afternoon when the snow is fresh and the wind has died. When they met in the middle, he stopped and looked at her. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at the cleared path, then at her. "When you got here, I thought you were trying to take over, like, come in and replace things, replace her." He stopped. I know now that isn't what you were doing, but I want you to know I know. I was wrong about you." She held his gaze. "You were protecting your family," she said. "That's not wrong." "I was protecting myself," he said. "I was scared." "Those are usually the same thing," she said. He considered this. Then, "She would have liked you, my mom." He said it directly, without the removed quality it had sometimes carried from other people's mouths. He said it as a thing he had decided, his own conclusion. "She liked people who didn't pretend things were easier than they were." "That's the kindest thing you've said to me," she said. He picked up his shovel. "Don't make it weird," he said. She laughed, genuinely, out loud, in the cold December air. And he glanced at her with a look that was trying not to be pleased with itself and failing, and they finished clearing the path and went inside. Christmas came to this Hawthorne ranch the way Christmas comes to places that have been through hard years. Not lavishly, not with the performed excess of people trying to prove something, but with the particular warmth of people who understand that the value of a day is in who you share it with and not in what you have to show. Evelyn had made garlands from dried things, pine branches from the scrubby trees at the edge of the north pasture, dried berries, a length of ribbon she had saved from the summer. Lucy had been her collaborator in this, with great enthusiasm and variable results, and the garlands were imperfect and genuine and strung across the mantel in the doorway with the confidence of people who knew exactly what they were worth. There were small gifts. She had knitted Noah a pair of gloves from the wool she had bought in town, because his old ones had gone thin at the fingers, and he had said nothing about it, which was exactly how he handled small privations, by not mentioning them and working around them. She had made Lucy a doll, cloth-bodied, with yarn hair and a dress sewn from the spare fabric in the storage chest. For Caleb, she had found, in the back of the general store in town, a book on range management that she thought he would actually use, not decorative, functional. He gave her a length of blue wool and said, without elaboration, that he had noticed she admired the color in town and thought she might do something with it. She held the fabric and felt the consideration behind it, that he had been paying attention, had registered a small unspoken preference, and carried it forward into an act of care. And she thought, this is what it looks like when it's real. This quiet, practical attention to the other person. This is the shape of it. Thank you, she said. I will. Lucy fell asleep after supper with her head on Evelyn's arm, and Evelyn sat with her there for a while before carrying her up to bed. And when she came back down, Caleb and Noah were at the table, and Noah was showing his father something in the geography book. An actual question, not a display. And Caleb was answering it, and the fire was going, and the garlands were across the mantel, and the portrait of Margaret Hawthorne was on the wall in the golden light. She stood in the doorway and looked at this room. She thought about the woman in that portrait, the woman with the direct gaze and the impractical horses and the song she sang when she thought no one was listening. She thought about what it means to love people enough to stay close to their grief rather than away from it. She thought about all the things that had happened in this house before she arrived and all the things that had happened since, and how neither the before nor the after could be the whole story alone. The Hawthorne family had not been rescued. That was the important thing, the thing she wanted to be clear about in her own mind, because she had no patience for that particular story. They had not needed rescuing. They had needed time and honesty, and someone willing to do the daily, unglamorous work of being present without demanding recognition for it. They had needed to be allowed to grieve and to remember and to slowly, on their own terms, come back to the living. She had been here for that. She had tried to do it with her eyes open and her expectations honest and her feet planted on the actual ground rather than on any version of this she had imagined on the train. It had cost her things. There were days it cost her patience, and days it cost her pride, and days it simply cost her the energy of being new in a place that knew how to be without her. Those costs were real. She did not pretend they were nothing, but here was the room. Here was the fire. Here was Noah asking his father a real question, and Caleb answering it in the real way, and Lucy asleep upstairs with her cloth doll, and the portrait on the wall, and the garlands that were imperfect and genuine, and Evelyn in the doorway, not looking in from outside but standing at the threshold of her own life, which was here, which was this. She walked into the room. Caleb looked up and she sat down at the table, and Noah showed her the question too because he apparently decided it was worth a second opinion, and she looked at the map and gave her honest view. And they were 3 people at a table on the Wyoming frontier on a December evening, imperfect and real, building something together in the only way anything is ever actually built. One ordinary day at a time, with patience and with the willingness to stay. Outside, the snow fell on the plain without hurry, covering the fences and the garden and the barn and the great flat distance. And inside the fire held, and the house was warm, and the Hawthorne family, all 4 of them, which is what they were now, settled into the night. There is something worth saying about what it means to belong somewhere. Not the feeling of belonging, which comes and goes and cannot be trusted entirely, but the decision of it. The choice, made daily, to put yourself into a place and a set of people and do the work of being present without holding back an escape route. Most people think belonging is something that happens to you, something granted by circumstance or blood or luck. The truth, as Evelyn Mercer had come to understand it on a Wyoming ranch in the hardest and most necessary year of her life, is that belonging is a thing you build. You build it with your hands and your patience and your honest daily presence, and it takes longer than you think it should, and it costs more than you expected, and it is worth every bit of what it costs, because what you are building is not a feeling but a life. A real one, with weight to it, with other people's histories woven into it, and your own woven back. She had come to this ranch with a single trunk and a marriage certificate, and the clear-eyed awareness that she was stepping into something difficult. She had not known, then, how difficult. She had not known how long the boy's grief would hold, or how quiet the man would be, or how much the little girl's need would reach inside her and rearrange things. She had not known about the portrait, or the dried sage, or the maple candy in the snow, or the birthday cake, or what it would feel like to stand in a doorway and understand that the room on the other side of it was hers. She knew now. And on the unforgiving Wyoming frontier, where survival had always demanded more than strength alone, 4 imperfect people had found their way to something that would outlast the winter. And the next one. And all the ones that came after. Not because it was easy, and not because it was perfect, but because they had each, in their own time and their own way, chosen to stay.
But yeah, I don't know if we're going to be able to make the whole thing with one skein. I'm hoping so. I think we should be able to. Y'all, you finished it. Exactly. So I did answer that. Going through this for over a year because they had to wait till my medical shit was wrapped up. Oh, I see what you're saying. I got you, Gio. You like comedy horror? You'd probably love the movie Ready or Not. Oh, okay. Okay, cool. Yeah. I'll have to take a look. Here's the thing, like I'm not really into gory movies, but when it's made with comedy and it's not like dark, okay, it depends on the movie, right? I have to be in the mood for it. But like when I know it's a comedy, what is going on with this? Oh, it's just this thing is, I have to, eventually I'm going to cover it with like a